When members of a seemingly ordinary blended family begin falling ill one after the other, a remarkably dedicated investigation revealed a murder plot that can only be described as diabolical. I'm Olivia LaVoice, the creator and host of the Casefile Presents Bakersfield Three podcast. Casey and I have selected some of Casefile's most memorable cases to be featured here, where you'll have a visual guide to the story. Today, we're diving into case number 239, Peggy Carr. It began as a typical Sunday for waitress Peggy Carr. It was a warm October morning in 1988 in South Central Florida, where the 41-year-old attended her shift at the Nicholas family restaurant. But somewhat suddenly, Peggy began to feel unwell, and it came on strong. She felt a sharp pain that seared in the middle of her chest. She instantly feared the worst and thought perhaps it was a heart attack. But one of her regular customers reassured her that wasn't the case, pointing out to Peggy that her breathing and pulse were normal, and the bright pink shade of her fingernails indicated she was getting plenty of oxygen. But as the day went on, Peggy continued to feel awful. Around lunchtime, her adult daughter, Galina, arrived at the restaurant where both mother and daughter worked together. Galina noticed something was off with her mother right away. Peggy was not one to complain about feeling sick. She told her daughter her hands were numb and her legs were aching. Galina touched her mother's hands and they were ice cold. Eventually, Peggy decided to leave work early and go lay down at home. Later that afternoon, Peggy's husband, Peggy Carr, came home from a hunting trip. Peggy noticed immediately his new wife was ill. Even her voice was quite weak. The two had only been married for about 6 months. It was both of their second marriage that resulted from a whirlwind courtship. After the wedding, Peggy moved into Peggy's home. When Peggy moved in, she brought her daughter Jelena and Jelena's 2-year-old daughter. She also brought her 17-year-old son Dwayne. It was a full house, as Peggy also had 2 of his own children living with him, his 18-year-old Tammy and 16-year-old son Travis. It was an adjustment as the large blended family got used to their new living arrangements. But Peggy and Peggy were committed to making it work. When Peggy found Peggy sick on the couch, his first instinct was to call his sister Carolyn, who was a nurse. But Carolyn couldn't find anything that was obviously wrong with Peggy. She told her all of her vitals were fine, aside from slightly high blood pressure, which she wasn't overly concerned about. But Peggy's daughter knew something was wrong. When she got home from her shift at the restaurant, she found Peggy in bed. Her skin was deathly white and her lips were badly chapped. Peggy was so weak that she couldn't even get up to walk to the bathroom. In a whisper, Peggy told her daughter, quote, "You don't know how bad it hurts. Do you hear what I'm saying? I am just hurting." Though initially he was reluctant, Jelena convinced Peggy that her mother needed to go to the hospital. At the ER, Peggy said it was excruciating to even have a doctor lightly touch her arm. She described the pain saying, "I feel like I'm on fire." The doctors were at a loss to what could possibly be going on with her. Tests they performed all came back normal, prompting one doctor to suggest that Peggy's symptoms might be psychosomatic, caused by a mental factor, meaning essentially, it was all in her head. This theory, of course, upset Peggy. Whatever her illness was, she knew it hadn't been caused by stress or her imagination. Peggy spent 3 days in the hospital, and although no one could figure out what had made her sick, she soon began to improve. She became well enough to sit up in bed, drink coffee, and even eat by herself. When she complained about the quality of the hospital's food, her daughter knew she was getting better. So Peggy was sent home that next day. Peggy's sister Carolyn brought over fried chicken for the family and served it alongside glasses of Coca-Cola. The next morning, Peggy's 16-year-old son Travis and Peggy's 17-year-old son Dwayne felt sick. And when their feet began to tingle, it became clear they were suffering from the same symptoms that Peggy had. Soon after, the boys felt a burning sensation in their bodies. Peggy's symptoms all started to come back as well and even worse than they were before. The next day, she was taken back to the hospital by ambulance. This time, Peggy was taken to Winter Haven Hospital, where she was examined by a neurologist named Dr. T. Richard Holster. The doctor asked Peggy to try to keep her eyes shut while he tried to open them. Her eyes opened easily, which apparently is very unusual for a healthy adult. Peggy was also extremely sensitive to touch, and her mouth was filled with ulcers. Peggy told the neurologist that her feet felt like they were on fire. Dr. Holster began to theorize that Peggy could have been poisoned by some kind of heavy metal. And when he found out that 2 of the family's children were also starting to have the same symptoms, that strengthened his conviction. The doctor asked that Travis and Dwayne be brought in for observation as well. According to Pye, there was no reason that a heavy metal should have been present in the home. Nonetheless, the doctors decided to have Peggy tested for lead, arsenic, mercury, and thallium poisoning. The first 3 were common as far as heavy metal poisonings go, but thallium, not so much. It's colorless, odorless, and tasteless. Thallium was once widely used throughout the United States as a rat poison and pesticide, but in 1972, the US banned its use due to safety concerns. Thallium is so highly toxic that mild contact with skin alone can be extremely dangerous. The fact that thallium was illegal made it rare and therefore extremely unlikely that Peggy Carr could have encountered it in her home accidentally. Yet the doctor was intrigued by Peggy's description of feeling like she was burning to death. Peggy's health continued to deteriorate rapidly. That evening, she was transferred to the intensive care unit where she lay in a bed surrounded by machines and tubes that were attached to her nose and mouth. Peggy's wrists had been tied down so she couldn't pull the tubes out. She had lost her ability to speak and open her eyes, but she was still conscious and aware when she was being spoken to. Both of Peggy's parents had been deaf, and she had learned sign language as a child, which now very much came in handy. When Peggy's sister asked the now unrecognizable Peggy how she was feeling, all she could do was sign back, hurt. The results of Peggy's tests came back quickly, and just as her doctor suspected, she tested positive for thallium. In fact, the amount of thallium in her system exceeded the amount the lab could measure. Dwayne and Travis tested positive for thallium as well, but at much lower levels. This is so heartbreaking. With the amount of thallium that Peggy had in her body, doctors knew it would be impossible for her to ever recover. The thallium was causing her nerves to waste away and die. Her symptoms would soon progress to paralysis, coma, and then death. In 1988, it was almost unheard of for someone to experience thallium poisoning, as it simply wasn't something people would encounter in their day-to-day lives. Dr. Holster was certain that Peggy's poisoning was not a tragic accident. It must have been deliberate. Doctors broke the news to Peggy's husband, Pye, who in turn told Peggy, as she lay in a hospital bed with her eyes closed, machines breathing for her, quote, "Peggy, do you know why you're here?" "No," Peggy signed back. "Peggy, you've been poisoned," Pye told her. All Peggy could do in response was sign the same word over and over. Why? 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 Dr. Holster told Pye he believed someone had tried to poison his family and somehow Pye had been spared. Pye responded, "I don't think anyone dislikes us enough to do that." Meanwhile, Dwayne and Travis continued to get sicker while Peggy became completely unresponsive. 3 days after Peggy arrived at Winter Haven Hospital, police attempted to interview her to see if she knew who might want to harm her, but she was unable to do anything except squeeze her sister's hand. The thallium eventually caused Peggy's muscles to become entirely paralyzed. She lost the ability to close her eyes and simply stared up blankly, unable to blink. It was inevitable that ulcers would form on her corneas. I mean, this is just what nightmares are made of. This has to be absolutely one of the worst ways to die. Doctors had to literally sew her eyes shut to protect them. Within weeks, Peggy fell into a coma, which turned to months, while Dwayne and Travis eventually did make full recoveries. Peggy's family came to accept that she, however, would never get better. They continued to visit and talk to her all the time, but on March 3rd, 1989, about 4.5 months after Peggy first became sick, the decision was made to take her off of life support. Peggy's 2 oldest children had their suspicions about who would want to kill their mother. See, when Peggy remarried, initially her children were happy for her. They felt she deserved some joy after her other relationships hadn't worked out. And Pye seemed to make her happy. But as the months went by, Peggy experienced some doubts, and it did not help when the couple's children began fighting with each other. Pye was employed at a phosphate mine and worked incredibly long hours, and apparently Peggy began to suspect that something else was going on. One night when Pye said he had to work late, Peggy and her daughter decided to investigate, and they found Peggy's suspicions were right. There were only 2 cars in the parking lot at the mine. Pye and his former girlfriend, who it turned out he was having an affair with. Peggy left the family home with her children and granddaughter, and she left a note for Pye that read, quote, "I do love you very, very much. Right now I'm at the point that I don't really know how you feel. I told you I could handle anything as long as I had you. Now I'm not sure. I'm going to give you some time to think about this. I can't live like we have been. No respect from the kids, not talking, not caring. I love you and I want to be your wife. Key word is wife. I don't know if this is right or not, what I'm doing, but I don't know what else to do. I can't imagine living without you, but I can if you don't want me. There's no question in my mind whether or not I want you, and I love you. Is there a question in your mind? I'll be okay if anyone is interested. I love you with all my heart, Peggy." Just a few days later, the couple reconciled and Peggy moved back into the home. That same day, Pye left for a previously scheduled hunting trip, which would keep him away all weekend. And when he returned, Peggy was sick on the couch. Her daughter had been disturbed by Pye's initial reluctance to take her mother to the hospital. She immediately began to wonder if he was behind Peggy's illness. Jelena confided in a coworker that she thought Pye and his sister Carolyn were poisoning her mother, and Peggy's son Alan soon began to feel the same way. The siblings weren't alone. Larry Dubberly, who was Peggy's ex-husband and Dwayne's father, was spending time at the hospital with his sick son. He overheard Pye being questioned about the poisoning by a police officer. Afterwards, he noticed that Pye was trembling all over. On another occasion, Larry was outside the hospital room where both teenage boys were staying when he heard a commotion from inside. He rushed in and saw Pye and Carolyn standing there as Pye's own son Travis screamed, "Larry, help me, they're trying to kill me." Pye's sister Carolyn tried to reassure everyone in the room they weren't trying to harm either boy. But Larry had noticed how Carolyn brought food to the hospital for the teens and wondered about her motives. Larry also claimed that Peggy had told him that Pye had taken out life insurance policies for her and both the boys. $80,000 for Peggy and $60,000 for each boy. And then Larry mentioned another troubling story. One day, several family members were gathered around discussing the thallium poisoning. One person speculated it may have come from the phosphate mines. Pye's ex-wife, who was present, faced Pye and said, "You've been working at Silver City Mines all these years. They've got 2 chemist labs out there. Do y'all have any of that shit out there? Do you know anything about this?" According to Larry, Pye told his ex-wife, "You shut your goddamn mouth." But on the other side, there were people, including Dr. Holster and the family's minister, who told investigators they didn't find Peggy Carr suspicious at all. They saw how Pye spent weeks by Peggy's side, talking to her constantly, even when she was unresponsive. Eventually, the entire Carr household was tested for thallium, and everyone except for Pye's daughter Tammy had traces of heavy metal in their system. Even Pye had enough in his body to make a smaller person unwell, but due to his size, Pye experienced only some slight aches and pains. So of course, the fact that Pye also had thallium in his system made detectives less suspicious of him. The fastest way they could get to the bottom of the crime was to figure out how and where the family had been exposed to thallium. This would also help calm residents of the ordinarily sleepy Florida town who were panicking after learning about the poisoning. Just in case the exposure had been accidental, environmental officials started testing the fields, orange groves, and water wells surrounding the area. These tests came up negative for thallium. Peggy Carr's workplace was searched and a tin of rat poison was recovered, but that tested negative for thallium. Detectives turned their attention towards the Carr home. They performed multiple sweeps of the house, carting off item after item to be sent off to a lab for testing. And nothing resulted positive for thallium. And then during a final inspection of the house, one detective noticed some broken glass on the kitchen floor. Kneeling down, he looked behind a nearby counter, and there was a trash bin underneath. And behind that was a carton of glass bottles of Coca-Cola. There were 8 bottles in total, and 3 of them were empty, while 4 were unopened. The final bottle had a broken neck, which was presumably where the broken glass had come from. The Coke bottles were tested, and it was found that they each had 0.5 gram to 1 gram of thallium in each bottle. 1 gram is enough to kill an adult, by the way, and less is required to kill a child. The empty bottles all had thallium residue at the bottom. 6 years earlier, in 1982, 7 people died in Chicago after taking Tylenol capsules that had been laced with cyanide and then sold on pharmacy shelves. As covered in episode 118 of Casefile, the case became known as the Chicago Tylenol murders. The story made national headlines and had huge ripple effects around the country. Investigators now on this case had to consider whether they were dealing with a similar crime. Their initial observations was there was no obvious signs that the Coke bottles had been tampered with. And in the full bottles, the liquid appeared to be the same color and consistency as a regular bottle of Coke. And although there were no reports of anyone else suffering from thallium poisoning, investigators visited the nearest Coca-Cola bottling plant in Tampa, Florida. After inspecting the way the plant's machinery operated and how the bottles were distributed, they concluded that it would have been impossible for anyone to place 8 poisoned bottles on the assembly line and have them put in the same carton. It appeared that the Carr family had been deliberately targeted with a carton that was tampered with after it was bought at a store. So here's where it starts to get crazy. Evidently, no one in the family actually knew where these bottles had come from. They had just appeared underneath the counter in the Carr home one day. And this was notable because the family usually purchased Pepsi instead of Coke. But that said, nobody thought anything of it, at least not enough to discuss it. Peggy recalled that when Peggy had first become sick, he'd made himself a whiskey and Coke from one of the bottles. Peggy's sister Carolyn said she had poured a glass of Coke for Peggy after she returned from her first hospital visit. Thinking that Peggy had some kind of virus, Carolyn encouraged her to keep her fluids up, but all this had done was increase the level of thallium in Peggy's body. Carolyn had also given Dwayne and Travis Coke when they complained of feeling sick. The bottles were sent to the FBI for examination. Underneath an extremely powerful microscope, they detected tiny scratch marks on a diagonal angle. This indicated that someone had removed the caps with something like a screwdriver or can opener, put the thallium inside, and then screwed the caps back on. Although the liquid in the full bottles looked like regular Coca-Cola, testing revealed it had lost some of its carbonation. Whoever had poisoned the bottles knew exactly what they were doing. It would have also taken some work for them to figure out how to get the correct ratio of thallium to use to ensure the liquid didn't change color or overflow from the bottle. While Peggy's 2 eldest children still suspected Peggy and Carolyn, detectives now were not so sure. They hadn't found any evidence of the supposed life insurance policies Peggy had taken out on his wife, son, and stepson. They also found it extremely unlikely that Peggy would have put his entire family at risk if he were looking to end his relationship with his new wife. And in general, they didn't find his behavior suspicious. And remember, Peggy's daughter Tammy was the only member of the family who did not test positive for traces of thallium. So this led to her being questioned as a possible suspect as well. Her explanation was that she only drank diet sodas, which is why she hadn't consumed any of the Coke. In time, detectives ruled her out. I think that sounds like a reasonable explanation. In time, the detectives ruled out all the family members and believed that the culprit was someone who'd came in from outside the home, tampered with the bottles, and snuck them into the house when no one else was there. But who in the world would have it out for this newly blended family to go to this extent? I mean, when you think about it, whoever did this knew they could possibly take out an entire family. Peggy Carr could not think of anyone who would do this and found it really hard to believe that it was possible that someone would have it out for them to this extreme. But Peggy's sister Shirley told investigators something that immediately caught their attention. 4 months before the poisonings, the Carr family had received a threatening letter. When Peggy was asked about the letter, he said he had forgotten all about it. But he managed to dig back up the envelope. It had been addressed to Peggy Carr, and inside was a small yellow piece of paper with a typed message that read, quote, "You and all your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you will all die. This is no joke." The family had all gathered together to study the note. The writer had misspelt Pye's first name as P-I-E instead of P-Y-E. Given that everyone who knew him knew the correct spelling, Pye and Peggy's children dismissed this as some sort of sick joke. But Peggy apparently was taking it seriously and told her kids to be extra careful, saying, "I want you to stay close to the house and be nice to people. This could be real." Our story pivots now, but stay with me. We're introducing you to a woman, 33-year-old Sherry Gowen. In the spring of 1989, 33-year-old Sherry came across a newspaper advertisement for an intriguing event. It was a murder mystery weekend taking place at a hotel in Winter Haven, Florida. The event was being hosted by a couple who were leaders of the local chapter of Mensa, an organization for people possessing an IQ in the top 2% of the population. Sherry typed a letter to one of the event's hosts, whose name was George Trepal. "Dear George, this letter is to request further information on the upcoming Mensa Murder Mystery Weekend. As I am considering moving to this county, I am compelled to find some type of stimulating entertainment. Although I am acquainted with the renowned Mensa organization, never before have I been involved in a lifestyle that would permit such endeavors. My background consists of years of dedicated service to my perfidious mate who took up his thriving career and moved upwards and onwards alone. A weekend filled with intrigue and intellect could be just what the doctor ordered. Sincerely, Sherry Gowen." Shortly after sending the letter, Sherry received a registration form and was excited to participate. She arrived at the Winter Haven Holiday Inn to attend the murder mystery weekend. At the registration desk, she met 39-year-old George Trepal, a small man with thinning hair and thick glasses. He handed Sherry a pamphlet of information for the weekend, and each guest was assigned a different role for the murder mystery, such as bystander, victim, or murderer. At some point, the victims would pretend to be killed, and other attendees would have to observe the events that followed closely, looking for clues as to who the murderers were. Sherry was given the role of bystander, and over the course of the weekend, Sherry struck up a couple of conversations with George. George spent most of his time organizing Mensa get-togethers, programming computers, and working as a freelance technical writer. His wife and co-host Diana worked as a doctor. Sherry learned that the couple were thinking about selling their home, and her interest immediately piqued. Sherry was in the process of divorcing her lawyer husband and would be able to buy a new place to live as part of the settlement. So George invited Sherry to come over and look at the house. A few days later, Sherry headed out to George's property for a tour. George lived in an isolated area amongst some orange groves. The house was decorated with 1970s decor, including yellow curtains and orange cabinets. It had a library crammed with books on scientific subjects. The main bedroom was also filled with books, which were mostly detective novels. Another room, which George described as his junk room, was full of crystals, rocks, and minerals. Visible through the junk room window was a small brownish, yellow-colored building. George explained it was a garage that his neighbors had converted into an apartment. George had reported them to the local building board for doing so, as they had not obtained the proper permit. The incident had caused some bad blood between George and his neighbors, who lived on the only other property in the immediate vicinity. George had not liked them, especially because one of them apparently constantly tried to sell him things, like a pickup truck. George said the neighbors had moved out and were possibly trying to sell the property for way over its value. Finally, George took Sherry through his garage workshop. Inside were lots of tools and jugs of what appeared to be chemicals. Ultimately, Sherry decided the house was way too big for her, but she stayed in touch with George and in time considered him a friend. George was sympathetic about Sherry's difficult divorce with her soon-to-be ex-husband, Richard. And apparently, George hated lawyers. And Richard, Sherry's estranged husband, was a lawyer. So George was very much into helping Sherry rid herself of him. One of George's ideas was to try to get George arrested by accusing him of molesting a child. Another idea was to send a threatening note to then-President George Bush and sign it with Richard's name. He also joked that Sherry should send him a poisoned flower delivery. And then in November of 1989, about a year after the Carr family was poisoned, George and his wife Diana left their home in Alturas and moved to a town about 40 miles away. With their home now empty, George told Sherry she was welcome to move in if she wanted to rent the home. While looking for a house to buy, Sherry moved in December 1989. About a month later, she called George to tell him she needed to meet and speak with him face-to-face immediately. Sherry did not waste any time getting to the point. She explained that shortly after moving into George's home, she had received a visit from a sheriff's deputy who was living next door. Sherry's voice shook as she said, "I think you neglected to tell me that something happened in the neighborhood." George sounded calm and unbothered as he replied, "Oh yeah, somebody got poisoned next door."
Oh yeah, somebody got poisoned next door.
You see, George's property bordered the house where Pi and Peggy Carr had lived. It had been 15 months now since Peggy Carr's poisoning and 10 months since her death. Pi Carr and the rest of the family had moved out of the house within 2 months of Peggy first getting sick. Now, George had never mentioned the unsolved murder to Sherry in all the time they had been friends, and Sherry thought this was odd, especially given his love for murder mysteries and detective novels. Sherry was struck by the matter-of-fact tone in which George discussed Peggy's poisoning. She reportedly said to him, "That might not be a lot to you, but it's a lot to me." George laughed and apologized to Sherry.
"That might not be a lot to you, but it's a lot to me."
Oh well, sorry.
They said they never caught the person that did it, and it really frightened me.
Sherry asked George if the poisoning was what prompted him and Diana to leave the neighborhood and if they were scared. George said back something along the lines of, "No. Apparently, it was some sort of personal vendetta." George said, "It's not like they're running around poisoning everybody." Sherry explained that some detective had dropped by to speak with her. They'd asked about George and his whereabouts. Sherry handed the detective's business card over to George, and he suddenly fell quiet. He told Sherry that he and Diana had already spoken to investigators twice, and he couldn't understand why they would be looking for him now, or why they'd be talking to Sherry about it. "I hope I'm not the prime suspect," George added. "That could be messy."
I hope I'm not a prime suspect. That could be messy.
As it turned out, George and his wife Diana had a history of issues with the Carr family long before Peggy or her children ever lived on the property. The issues seemed to stem from Pi's dog jumping over the fence to George's yard and chasing his cats. When that young, healthy dog fell ill and died, Pi suspected the pup had been poisoned, but couldn't imagine who would actually do such a thing. When Peggy moved in years later, tensions flared again between the neighbors. Apparently, George and Diana thought the Carr household was much too noisy, and in retaliation, George disconnected the water supply for the well that the Carrs used. George was also unhappy about the way that Peggy and Pi's teenage sons rode their motorcycles through the area. There was a lake besides George's house, and he had added some sand to the area to create a little beach. Pi's son Travis had once ridden his motorbike on the beach, messing up the sand. An upset George had reported the incident to Pi, who replied, "Kids will be kids." In October 1988, George and Diana had made several complaints about how loud the Carrs' sons were playing their radio while hanging out in the garage. While Pi was away on his hunting trip, Diana came over to complain, and a verbal altercation broke out between her and Peggy. The next day, Peggy fell ill from the poisoning that eventually ended her life. When the detectives investigating Peggy Carr's homicide learned that a threatening letter had been sent to the family months before Peggy's death, warning them to, quote, "move out of Florida or else you all die," they initially wondered whether Pi Carr himself could have written it. It seemed unbelievable that he had forgotten to mention this letter. They asked Pi, of course, if he knew of anyone who would want to harm his family. While Pi initially couldn't think of anyone, he did manage to say that the only people they'd ever had trouble with were their neighbors, George and his wife, Diana. This was a major breakthrough for detectives, who were already fairly confident that the Carr family had been targeted by an outsider instead of from within. But the remote location of their property meant it would have been incredibly difficult for someone to sneak in a poisoned carton of Coca-Cola without being seen. Someone was almost always at home, and they would have noticed if any strange cars were in the area. Whoever had committed the crime had to have struck when the house was empty. The only house with a view of the Carr residence was George Trepal's. And get this, in the past, Pi's teenage daughter Tammy had received obscene phone calls when she was home alone. The caller often called right after Tammy's mother left the house, and he would describe exactly what Tammy was wearing, indicating that he was watching her. 2 days before Peggy got sick, there had been a window of time when no one was home. The back door to the Carr property didn't always latch properly and could sometimes be opened when it appeared to be locked. Around the time that Peggy and the 2 teenagers had been admitted to the hospital, Pi found the back door open. A profile of Peggy's poisoner had been built by an agent from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. The agent said that most people who choose poison as their murder weapon were intelligent individuals who liked to solve problems without direct confrontation. The agent also believed that the culprit would be an educated white man in his mid-30s. He would see himself as intellectually superior to others. George Trepal fit the profile almost to a T. A little digging revealed that George had a criminal record. In September 1975, he was arrested by a federal agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration. He had been operating a large illegal methamphetamine lab in North Carolina and was involved in manufacturing the drug himself. The agent described George as, quote, "probably the smartest chemist that I've ever known." To make methamphetamine, George used a chemical known as P2P. Although this could be bought legally, federal drug agents kept records of people who purchased it. To get around this problem, George sometimes brewed his own P2P. Homemade P2P was sometimes made using the heavy metal thallium. After being convicted of running an illicit drug lab, George was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. George found himself frustrated by his fellow inmates. In particular, he hated how loud some of them played their radios. He even sent a lengthy memo to prison officials complaining about the matter. Not long after it was determined that Peggy Carr had been poisoned, detectives visited George at home. George sounded slightly nervous and hesitant and didn't express any sorrow for what the Carrs had gone through. He said he didn't know his neighbors well, but they would wave and say hello when they saw each other. "They're not really our kind of people," George added. When asked if he had any problems with Pi Carr and his family, George became more animated. He complained that Pye had always tried to sell him things like a barbecue pit made from a 50-gallon drum, random, which apparently really irritated George. The detectives asked George what he knew about thallium. He said he knew nothing at all except what he had heard on news reports about the case. Why would someone want to poison the Carr family? One of the detectives asked. It was a standard question they'd been asking everyone they spoke to in relation to the case. The details of the threatening letter had never been made public. Most people said they had no idea why, or suggested the culprit must have hated the family. But George's answer was unique. He nodded his head towards the Carr property and said, to get them to move, like they did. George Trepal was becoming an increasingly likely suspect, but with no physical evidence linking him to the case, prosecutors decided to hold off on pressing charges. But detectives had an idea. They recruited a colleague at the Polk County Sheriff's Office to help with the investigation. The colleague was 33-year-old Susan Gorek. She worked on a number of undercover drug cases before and was eager to help uncover evidence. The investigation into George was dubbed Operation Pale Horse, a reference to the Agatha Christie novel in which the killer murders his victims with thallium. Agent Gorek spent several weeks reading up on George and observing him as he went about his daily business. She and a colleague also searched a dumpster outside of his office looking for incriminating evidence. Ideally, something linking him to a thallium supplier, but nothing was found. After Peggy Carr died, detectives decided they needed to try a different approach. They would assign an undercover agent to try to get close to George in the hopes that he might confide his secrets. They thought a woman would be best, as George would have viewed her as non-threatening. Susan Gorek was given the task. She constructed her alter ego, a divorcee named Sherry Gowen. Knowing that George Trepal hated lawyers, Agent Gorek decided her fictional ex-husband would be an abrasive attorney. She would flatter George and earn his sympathy by discussing her marital problems with him. A Mensa murder mystery weekend that George was hosting was Agent Gorek's Inn. She sent him a letter, you may remember, posing as Sherry, asking to attend. And over the course of that weekend, Agent Gorek looked for clues and took numerous photographs. She took particular note of a pamphlet that George had written up for the weekend, which was titled Voodoo for Fun and Profit. The title was a nod to the theme of the murder mystery, which was centered around voodoo practitioners. An excerpt of the pamphlet read, "Few Voodists believe they can be killed by psychic means, but not one doubts that he can be poisoned. When a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. Hardly anyone dies from magic. Most items at the doorstep are just a neighbor's way of saying, 'I don't like you, you move or else.'" To investigators, this appeared to be a not-so-subtle reference to the poisoned Coca-Cola bottles that appeared at the Carr home. Over the course of 8 months, Agent Gorek built a friendship with George. She complained to him about her fictional ex-husband, hoping that it might coax a confession out of him. The undercover operation was a long, slow process, and eventually the higher-ups began to complain about the lack of results. But a breakthrough finally occurred when George and his wife Diana moved out of their home in November 1989. Agent Gorek then asked to rent the home, giving her complete access to the property. After Agent Gorek moved into the home, crime scene techs descended on the property that same night. There was an incredibly thorough process to look for traces of thallium. Techs also zeroed in on George's garage, which he hadn't bothered to clear out. A couple of small bottles were found on George's workbench. One was made of brown glass and had white residue inside. These were packaged up to be examined at the FBI lab while investigators were waiting for the results to come back. Agent Gorek met with George as Sherry to tell him that she knew about the poisoning next door. She hoped that he might be shocked into giving something away. Although George did seem to be rattled, he didn't say anything incriminating. In March 1990, 1 year after Peggy Carr's death, the results came back from the property search. The brown bottle found in the garage had tested positive for thallium. Soon after, Agent Gorick called George and said in a shaky voice, "Hi, George, it's Sherry. Those two investigators came to the house again this morning. They were asking about you again, something about some chemicals. I don't know what they're talking about. Do you?" George told Agent Gorick to calm down as she was growing increasingly distraught. The two chatted for a while, and then Agent Gorick heard a disturbance on George's end. In a calm tone, George suddenly said, "Sherry, by coincidence, the police are here. You'll have to call back." While Agent Gorick had been talking to George, investigators had been making their way to his home, armed with a warrant for his arrest. George's wife, Diana, tried to refuse them entry and had to be pulled from the doorway to the front yard. Diana yelled and swore at the police, but George seemed relaxed as he met them at the top of the stairs. Oh, and here's a fun fact. He apparently was wearing only a pair of women's bikini briefs. George got dressed and was then placed under arrest for the murder of Peggy Carr. Meanwhile, investigators carried out a search of George's new residence. Among his belongings, they found a loose-leaf binder filled with pages taken from scientific textbooks. George had written a title on the front, "General Poisoning Guides." Inside the binder featured information for law enforcement on identifying poisoning cases, and there was another book titled "Poison Detection in Human Organs," and there was a detailed paragraph in there about thallium. And then there was this. A large amount of bondage equipment and toys were found in a closet. In another room, a secret compartment behind a pegboard lined with tools revealed a tiny soundproofed room. It had black paneled walls and no windows. On the floor was a wooden platform the size of a bed with manacles attached to it. I don't even know what that is. It looks as though the room had only been recently built, and to detectives, George had made his own little torture chamber. News of George's arrest came as a shock to his fellow Mensa members. To them, George was a friendly man who rescued stray cats. Peggy Carr's children were also in disbelief that their eccentric former neighbor could do such a thing, especially over something as minor as loud music. George pleaded not guilty, and his trial began in January 1991. FBI scientists testified about the way that Peggy had been poisoned and the bottles with traces of thallium found in George's home. Agent Susan Gorick was the state's star witness, of course. The day after she testified about her undercover work on the case, George's wife Diana approached the agent outside the courtroom and screamed, "I hope you know what a bitch you are." George's defense was that the evidence against him was entirely circumstantial. His defense team pointed out the other possible suspects whom they felt investigators hadn't considered, such as George's wife, Diana. Oof. They also queried why detectives had been so quick to rule out Peggy Carr's husband, given that the couple had been having marital issues. This is interesting. His defense team cited a Jack Daniels bottle that had been found in the Carr's shed and was filled with some sort of pesticide that health officials had never tested, so they couldn't say whether or not that bottle had thallium in it, which is pretty crazy. Too bad we don't have more details on that. It's a good defense. Anyhow, the trial ran for 4 weeks. The jury ultimately found George Trepal guilty of 15 counts, including 1 count of first-degree murder and 6 counts of attempted first-degree murder. At the jury's recommendation, George was sentenced to death by lethal injection. 32 years later, George Trepal remains on death row. He is now 74 years old and maintains his innocence. All of his appeals, however, have been unsuccessful. To this day, George has what seems to be a decent amount of supporters who believe he is innocent and feel the case against him is very circumstantial. They describe George as a gentle man that they have never known to be violent. But investigators, including Agent Susan Gorick, who spent a year getting to know George, have no doubt that the man dubbed the Mensa murderer is, in fact, guilty. In 1995, Agent Gorick co-wrote a book about the case with journalist Jeffrey Good, titled Poison Mind. The book details Agent Gorick's undercover work as Sherry Gwynn and examines the impact that the case had on Peggy Carr's family. Sadly, Peggy's children drifted away from their stepfather, Peggy Carr, and his kids. And apparently they all have mixed feelings about George's death sentence. Peggy Carr told the Ledger newspaper that he's still waiting for the day when he can see the death sentence carried out. He said, quote, "I still want to be there when he's executed, but I don't have anything to say to him. I don't think I could control myself if I were to talk to him." Two of Peggy's children, Dwayne and Galena, say they have forgiven George and don't believe he should be executed. But Peggy's son, Alan, disagrees. He believes that George losing his life is a consequence he must suffer for his actions. I think this is truly an unbelievable story. I mean, when you think about the lengths that George Trepal went to, it seems just to get the Carr family to move out. And it's sickening to think of the horrific death that Peggy Carr went through. I mean, her eyes had to be sewn shut. Unreal. Thank you for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Until next time.